Hello and welcome to the Essex Boys Murder Case Part 47. Before watching this video, I recommend watching Part 4 onwards on YouTube first, as these videos are all about the key individuals and the murder victims' movements on the day of the 6th of December 1995. A quick mention to the Facebook page called The Real Essex Boys Murder Club. If you're interested, please feel free to join, as there's some great people on there with a lot of knowledge on this subject. So this is the fourth instalment of the Hitman videos to see if Mick Steele, Jack Wooms and Darren Nichols paid a contract killer to take out the Essex Boys. In part 1, I discussed if Mick Steele and the others had a meeting at the notorious Bowers crime family from North East London at their gym and put them in contact there with a contract killer they knew would be perfect for the job of taking out the Essex Boys. From there, Mick Steele and the others told the hitman their plan to lure the Essex Boys to the Redden area, then down a quiet farm track where the hitman would be lying in wait to begin the executions. In part 2, I discussed an Alan Grayston statement and what he said he saw as he drove past the farm track 2 days before the murders. In part 3, I discussed the balaclava man witnessed by a Joseph Kowalinsky on the night of the murders. Now in this video, I'm going to discuss one of the hitmen who was active in the Essex area at the time. If you've been on the Facebook group and scrolled through the posts, you may have come across the acid attack on a Darren Kerr. If you've not come across the acid attack on Darren Kerr, then I'm going to go through it in this video and see if it was possible the hitman was also paid to take out Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. On the 31st of August 1995, which was about 3 months prior to the Essex Boys murders, a Darren Kerr, who was 24 at the time and a local villain, lived on St Mary's Lane in Upminster. Now he was travelling along the A13 and turned off into the area of Purfleet, Essex. Now somewhere in the area of Purfleet, he decided to get out of his car and use a telephone box. He was then ambushed in the telephone box by 2 men. He was hit repeatedly. Then one of the men sprayed acid in his face. They then bundled him into the back of a Mercedes they had stolen days before. They then drove around so the acid could eat deeper into his flesh. When he realised they weren't going to let him go, and the pain he was receiving from the acid on his face, he managed to escape when the vehicle stopped at a set of traffic lights. The assailants then drove into him, fleeing from the scene. Motorists came to his aid and his face was bathed in water at a nearby garage in the Dagenham area before paramedics turned up and rushed him in an ambulance to the burns unit at St Andrew's Hospital in Billericay, Essex. The following day, a hitman dressed as a clown with Dracula teeth entered the hospital holding a bunch of flowers. He then asked bemused nurses which room Darren Kerr was in. When they told him which room he was in, he set off. The hitman dropped the flowers after entering the room and produced a shotgun and fired at Kerr. Kerr realised what was going on and managed to turn away, but in the melee he was shot in the shoulder and survived the attack. After the attempt on Kerr's life, the hitman calmly walked away and left the hospital. A few years later, in early 1998, a male dressed as a clown was seen at 4:30 p.m. in Wickford, Essex. He went down a driveway with a handgun and attempted to steal a vehicle. He could not gain entry to the vehicle and fled on foot down the street. The owners of the property rang the police and gave a description. The police turned up and did a sweep of the area, but couldn't find him. That was the last time the supposed hitman, dressed as a clown, was ever seen again. Is it possible Tucker, Tate and Rolfe knew this hitman and offered him a large amount of money to take out Steve Nipper Ellis, who had already shot Pat Tate? Ellis had already shot at Tony Tucker and Craig Rolfe a few days after shooting Tate. He had also threatened Tony Tucker on his landline, saying that he was driving around Essex looking for him. Tucker took the threat from Ellis serious, as he knew if he was driving about in the Essex area and Ellis found him, he would not hesitate to shoot him. Now, years later, after the murders, Ellis found out that Tony Tucker had been paranoid after the threatening phone call from Nipper. Tucker was lending his vehicle to a friend to drive around the Basildon area almost every day. If Tucker's car was spotted by Nipper, then he would shoot his friend instead of him. Now, Tucker's friend spoke to Nipper about this years later, that he'd spotted Nipper at a set of traffic lights. When the lights changed, he drove on, but Nipper had to stop as the lights had gone back to red. Nipper told him he thought he was Tucker and was going to chase him down and shoot him. Tucker's friend told Nipper he did find it strange that Tucker would ring him up almost every day, saying he could borrow his car whenever he wants. Did Tony Tucker make contact with his hitman and offer him a large amount of money to take out Steve Nipper Ellis? Did the hitman get a better offer from a Canning Town firm who had their travellers' cheque stolen a few weeks or so earlier by the Essex boys, and decided the Canning Town firm's offer was more lucrative and decided to double cross the Essex boys on the meet that night down the farm track? So who were the assailants who attacked Darren Kerr, and what was it all about? Did they hire a hitman to kill Darren Kerr a day later at St Andrew's Hospital in Billericay and was paid to execute Tucker, Tate and Rolfe? On the 31st of August 1995, local villain Darren Kerr, who at the time lived on St Mary's Lane in Upminster, drove along the A13 and turned off and headed towards the Purfleet area. Now, he drove along this road here and decided to pull up and use a telephone box. Now, as he entered the telephone box, a Mercedes pulled up with two men inside. Thomas Watkins and Russell Jones got out of the vehicle and ambushed him. They attacked him, pushing him up against his car and repeatedly hitting him. Russell Jones then squirted acid in Kerr's face, hitting the left side. They then dragged him into the Mercedes and drove off, heading towards the direction of Dagenham. Watkins and Jones drove around this area of Dagenham and weren't going to let Kerr go. The acid was eating into his flesh. Now, Kerr knew these two villains from Southend and had done for 10 years. The attack was over a debt of £10,000 owed by Kerr. Now, whilst in this area, Jones asked him about the £10,000 he owed them over a crime they had all committed. Now, it is alleged Russell Jones said in the car, Tommy has a gun, and you are lucky you don't get shot. Now, when the Mercedes had to stop at a set of traffic lights, Kerr managed to escape from the vehicle. They then drove the vehicle into Kerr before driving off. Now, motorists came to Kerr's aid and they managed to get some water from a nearby garage and bathe his face until an ambulance arrived. And this is the garage here. He was then rushed to the burns unit at St Andrew's Hospital in Billericay, Essex. Now, the police began to investigate and took fingerprints from Kerr's vehicle, which was left in Purfleet. The police were also waiting for a good time to get a statement from Kerr in the next few days after he was in a more stable condition. Did Jones and Watkins ring the local hospital saying they were relatives of Kerr and wanted to know how his condition was, then pass this information on to a hitman and pay to have him killed? Personally, I don't think this is possible to organise and pay a hitman a day later. Not for me. I think Jones and Watkins knew Kerr would give a statement as soon as he was in a more stable condition. Jones and Watkins didn't finish what they had planned to do. They now had to shut him up for good and devise a plan to ring round all the hospitals in the Essex area that specialised in burns and pretended to be a concerned family member of Kerr, asking how he is. Now, one of them needs to go inside the hospital in disguise as not to be identified via CCTV, which they did have back then. They then arrive outside the hospital and park up somewhere close by. I think it was Watkins who dressed as a clown due to Jones telling Kerr the day before that Tomo has a gun and was going to shoot you. Jones has already done his part by throwing acid in Kerr's face the day before. So Watkins, dressed as a clown so he can't be identified by anyone at the hospital, gets out of a car holding a bunch of flowers, and behind the bunch of flowers is a shotgun. He heads towards the main entrance and goes to the reception area in the late evening. He asks where Darren Kerr's room is as he wants to cheer him up. The bemused nurses tell him which room he's in, and Watkins makes his way towards the room Kerr's resting in. I mean, Watkins is not bothered about the nurses knowing his accent, as they've never met him before. When he reaches Kerr's room, he opens the door. Now, he knows he's not going to leave fingerprints as he's wearing white gloves. He sees Kerr, drops the flowers and aims the shotgun at his head. Now, Kerr sees what's going on and twists away, taking a hit to the shoulder. I mean, Kerr even states, "I did not see him at first because he came from the left, my blind side. I saw him late. He was aiming for my head. It was an instinctive reaction to twist away, and that's what saved my life." Now, Watkins can't say anything because Kerr would recognise his voice. So he calmly walks away and makes his escape from the hospital to the getaway car that his partner in crime, Russell Jones, is driving. So, Darren Kerr was attacked on the 31st of August 1995 by Russell Jones and Thomas Watkins. A day later, on the 1st of September 1995, a hitman dressed as a clown walked into St Andrew's Hospital in Billericay and shot Kerr, and Kerr survived the attack. On the 6th of December 1995, Tucker, Tate and Rolfe were executed in Rettendon down a farm track. Now, some rumours were going round in criminal circles at the time were that the Essex boys were down the track that night to meet a hitman in order to pay for his services, but someone got in there first and paid for them to be shot. Now, the last sighting of the clown was just over 2 years later, in early 1998. Jones and Watkins' trial had not started yet, as that started in late March 1998. So, in early 1998, a sinister gunman disguised with a ginger-haired clown mask was being hunted in the area of Wickford, Essex, after attempting to steal a car off a driveway. Now, on a Saturday afternoon at 4:30 p.m, the owner of the vehicle arrived home and found the clown lying in wait in his driveway. Now, he was ordered to hand over his keys. When he refused, the clown produced a firearm. Now, the victim, who had some knowledge of weapons, recognised it was a revolver-type handgun. The two began to wrestle, and the armed man fled. Now, he jumped into a getaway car, which was a silver Ford Escort Estate. The registration number was F684TAR, which was waiting nearby. Now, the vehicle roared off in the direction of Wickford Town Centre, which is in this direction. The Ford Escort Estate had been stolen that day from Chelmsford Town Centre. Now, from this information, there was two assailants, as one was attempting to steal a car while the other was waiting in his getaway car. Now, the police said the area where it happened is fairly closed off, so they didn't expect any witnesses. The victim was taken to hospital for treatment to a minor hand injury. The victim in the attempted robbery was unable to give a detailed description of the man, but noticed he wore jogging bottoms and trainers. The clown mask was white with a red nose and lips and ginger hair that covered his own. The driver of the getaway car was white with mid-length wavy black hair. So, after the failed robbery attempt, they drove through Wickford Town Centre, then drove down the A132 and eventually turning off onto the A127 towards Basildon, which is in this direction. Now, as they drove along the A127, they eventually turned off here at this pub car park. And this is where they dumped the vehicle, at the Dick Turpin pub. Now, to me, these two definitely had knowledge of the Basildon area. I mean, they knew exactly which route to take to get out of the main Wickford area and dump the vehicle here at this car park. Then they made off on foot. So yes, to me, they knew the Basildon area. Now, this pub here, the Dick Turpin, is only 4 miles from where Pat Tate lived on Gordon Road. And it's about 5.5 miles from the White House Farm track in Rettendon, and 8 miles from the Halfway House pub where Darren Nichols says him, Mick and Jack drove to on the night of the murders. I do think the two car thieves would have known the Basildon area, and they would have known where Rettendon was, and Brentwood, where the Halfway House pub is. Now, the police said they found the abandoned vehicle at this car park early the following morning. They also said the case has overturns of a Billericay shooting in September 1995, when a lone gunman dressed as a clown blasted criminal Darren Kerr in the shoulder as he lay in a hospital bed recovering from an acid attack. The gunman was never found. Is this incident connected to Kerr's attack at the hospital in Billericay? I'd say yes, 100%. What I'm going to do now is go through the trial of Russell Jones and Thomas Watkins, and then give you my opinion of what I think it was all about, and then give you my reasons why the attack on Kerr is linked to the case of the attempted robbery of the car in Wickford. After that, I'm going to give you my opinion on if the hitman in this video has anything to do with the Essex boys' executions or not. So, the trial begins in late March 1998, some 2.5 years later after the attack on Kerr. Now, top right of this picture is Russell Jones, which is the one who threw acid in Kerr's face. And in the bottom left is Thomas Watkins. What I'll do is read the newspaper clipping for you, so you'll get a better idea of what went on. A thug was jailed for 16 years for launching a callous acid attack on a rival, who was then shot by a mysterious gunman dressed as a clown as he lay recovering in hospital. Darren Kerr from Upminster was left disfigured and blind in one eye, having acid sprayed on his face and then beaten by Russell Jones. While Kerr, now in hiding at a secret address, lay in Billericay Burns unit after the acid attack, an unknown gunman dressed as a clown shot him in the shoulder after pulling a shotgun from under a bunch of flowers. Jones, who denied charges of GBH with intent and false imprisonment, smiled as he was found guilty after the Old Bailey jury deliberated for more than 9 hours. The judge said, "This was a horrible vengeance for any man to inflict on another man. It was premeditated. It was vicious. And you never let your own ultimatum expire before you inflicted these injuries on a man who for 10 years had been your friend." Jones even later bragged, "Now I know what I'm capable of." Following the attack on August the 31st, 1995. Now his accomplice, Thomas Watkins from Southend, was jailed for 5 years after being found guilty of the same offences, although he did not spray any acid. He pleaded not guilty. The jury had to be specially protected after a first trial last year was bedevilled by accusations of jury nobbling, and in this case. So there you go, 2 villains in the Essex area who weren't afraid to show mercy to their victim. They even tried to bribe the jury at a previous trial, and the one they were eventually found guilty at. I mean, what else were they capable of, and how well known were they in criminal circles? Did they work together, or were they part of a crime firm? What I'll do now is give you my opinion on what it was all about. Kerr, Jones and Watkins have all committed a crime in the past, probably a few, and on the last occasion Kerr looked after the money, and in true villainy, where there's no honour among thieves, has decided to keep the money, which was £10,000, to himself. I mean, all three men had known each other for 10 years. Kerr, at the time, was living in St Mary's Lane, Upminster, but Jones and Watkins lived in Southend, 22 miles away. So, sometime in the past, I'd say Kerr lived in Southend, and all three men were committing serious crimes together. In fact, I'm sure I've read it somewhere. Kerr previously lived in South Benfleet, which is just 9 miles from Southend. So they probably were committing serious crime whilst they were all living close to each other prior to Kerr moving miles away to Upminster. So all three men are villains in their area and are prepared to use firearms. They've done a bit of graft and Kerr's keeping hold of the 10,000 from their last crime. Now he's moved to Upminster and not told the others, and he decided to keep the money for himself. Now Jones and Watkins are furious and desperate to get their money back and teach Kerr a lesson. Now they could have been tipped off as to where Kerr lived through his family or friends in the criminal fraternity. They've then driven up to Upminster and parked close by to his address on the 31st of August 1995 and followed him when he went out. Kerr eventually realised that he was being followed probably along the A13, and that he then decided to turn off in Purfleet and find a telephone box in that area to ring the police. But Jones and Watkins got him before he could make that call. I mean, it's the only reasonable explanation I can think of as to why they managed to find Kerr miles away from his house, and the other two are now, 25 miles away from where they live in Southend? I mean, what's the chances of Jones and Watkins finding Kerr miles away from where they live? And Kerr is nowhere near his home address. I do think they've been tipped off as to where Kerr lived. Pulled up nearby and waited for him to set off somewhere. He's realised they are following him, so he's panicked and tried to find a telephone box. When he's come off the A13, and he's ended up in Purfleet. They got out and ambushed him before he could ring the police, and giving him a beating, pushed him up against Kerr's car and carried on beating him. Jones has then sprayed acid in his face. They've then dragged him into their Mercedes. They decided to drive him around so the acid would eat into his face, so he was in a lot of pain. I do think they would have tortured him somewhere and eventually shoot him if they couldn't get their money back from a crime they had all committed. Now when Kerr escapes, whilst the car is in a stationary position at a set of traffic lights in Dagenham, Jones and Watkins try and kill him by running him over, but fail. When they flee from the area, they are now panicking because they didn't finish Kerr off. The next day, they decide to ring round the local burns unit hospitals to find out which he was in. With Jones committing the acid attack, it was down to Watkins, and he would have dressed up as a clown and enter the hospital and shoot him. Jones would be the getaway driver. I really do think it was these two that tried to finish off Kerr at the hospital. I mean, after all, these two didn't want him giving a statement to the police. they had everything to lose. I mean, no way could they organise a hitman for the following day to kill Kerr. To me, these two organised it, and it was Watkins' turn. Kerr said he saw the clown with a gun and twisted away when he was shot at. He never says the clown spoke. Probably because Watkins would have known that if he did speak, then Kerr would recognise his voice. I mean, unbeknown to Jones and Watkins, that fingerprints were taken from Kerr's car, which had their prints on it, which led to them, to the Mercedes they had stolen, and theirs and Kerr's fingerprints were all over it. A few days later, they were arrested. Now, moving on to the attempted robbery of a vehicle in early 1998, before the trial of Watkins and Jones. Was this them two trying to do an armed robbery or commit one last crime before they were sent down and needed two getaway vehicles? Having stolen one already, they decided to look in the Wickford area for another. Now, if you recall earlier in this video, I mentioned the victim gave a description of the guy wearing the clown mask. And he also gave a really good description of the other assailant sat in the getaway vehicle. He said he was white with mid-length curly black hair. I think it was Watkins on the left. I mean, let's just get a close-up of him. There you go. That is Watkins. I mean, he's got the exact same hairstyle the victim described. I mean, these two are also using a clown mask in the robbery, just like they did in the shooting of Kerr. I think Jones was attempting to steal the vehicle and produced a handgun and wrestled with the victim. To me, the attack on Kerr and this alleged robbery are both done by the same people, and there is no clown hitman. I mean, that definitely looks like the man waiting in a getaway car the victim gave a description of. I really do think it was these two. Now, these two are dangerous criminals prepared to use firearms to commit crimes. Watkins was supposedly armed on the day they kidnapped Kerr. I think Kerr was as well, due to the fact it was brought up in court. He was a criminal. It's not known if Jones and Watkins committed a crime together or were part of a crime firm, but one thing's for sure, they would have been known in the criminal underworld and weren't afraid to use firearms. They were from the South End area, and Tony Tucker's doors were there. I mean, he actually had the doors in South End. Pat Tate had a few knocking shops in the South End area too. Were they known to the Essex boys? Did Tony Tucker ask about in the criminal underworld who the shooter was? The shooting at the hospital happened on the 1st of September 1995, and the Essex boys were executed in December 1995. That's a 3-month gap. Someone must have known who Thomas Watkins and Russell Jones were, especially in the criminal underworld. By the sounds of it, these two had bad reputations. I mean, just look what they have done to Darren Kerr, their friend for 10 years. who owed them £10,000 from a job they had all done. He had to move and was given a new identity. I mean, they beat him up. They threw acid in his face. They then drove him around a town so the acid could eat into his flesh, causing him serious pain. If they had a place already chosen, I do think they would have taken him there and tortured him to death. I mean, Watkins apparently had a firearm on him, according to his friend Jones. Was this the firearm that was used to shoot Kerr the following day? It's a strong possibility. I mean, to me, these two had access to firearms and certainly weren't afraid to use them. All three men had done criminal activities in the past. Maybe armed robberies or double-crossing drug dealers like Tony Tucker and Craig Rolfe did many a times. I mean, Watkins and Jones must have been known in the criminal underworld. I mean, were they linked to any known criminal networks? Had they ever done any work for London crime families or syndicates? I mean, they must have known some well-connected people in the underworld because of not just jury nobbling the first time at their trial, but even tried to nobble the jury members at the second trial. I mean, I personally think these two were well connected to an organised crime network from London. Which one? I just don't know. Knowing they were capable of using firearms, did Tony Tucker arrange to meet these two? Or if they really was a hitman, maybe so he could pay them for their services to shoot Nipper Ellis, but another firm had already paid for their services first. Was it the Canning Town firm who had their travellers' checks stolen by the Essex boys a few weeks earlier? After taking a beating at a car park in Canning Town and the travellers' checks took off him, the guy managed to escape and ran off saying, "You haven't heard the end of this." Was Jones and Watkins known by the Canning Town firm and had heard of the robbing of the travellers' checks and told them Tony Tucker wanted to meet up with them or the hitman who dressed as a clown about paying them or him to put out a hit out on Nipper Ellis, but the Canning Town firm were willing to pay more to put a hit out on them? That night, down the farm track, was Tony Tucker and the others meeting up with these two to discuss payment for a hit to be put out on Nipper Ellis, but in fact they were the intended victims and were executed on behalf of the Canning Town firm who were willing to pay more? Were Jones and Watkins driving that white Sierra Cosworth that was seen following a Range Rover that evening by a witness called Rebecca Carr and described Tony Tucker who was in it? In Nipper Ellis's book, he says he was contacted by that Canning Town firm and threatened him as they believed he was in on the travellers' checks robbery with Tony Tucker and the others, but he told them him and Malcolm Walsh had no idea the others were going to rob one of their firm's men. They eventually took him on his word and they decided to go after the others. At this time, the feud between the Essex boys and Nipper hadn't begun. Now we know Carlton Leach was there that day at the car park and he was the one that attacked the Canning Town guy. Then Tony Tucker joined in and took the travellers' checks. Why wasn't Carlton Leach killed with the others? In past documentaries, he did say he was supposed to be in the Range Rover that night. I'm going to finish this video now as I have covered everything about the first hitman who was apparently active back in 1995. I've covered Darren Kerr's attacks, the two men who did it first, and if they devised a plan to shoot him in a hospital, or if they did indeed pay for a hitman dressed as a clown to do it. I've also covered if they may have had anything to do with the Essex boys' murders. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and don't forget, YouTube subscribers, you get to watch these videos first, as I don't upload them to the Facebook group for at least a week later. And don't forget, you can join the Facebook group called The Real Essex Boys Murder Club. All we ask is respect other people's theories on there, as we all have our own opinions on what we think happened that night. Last of all, I'd like to thank the admins who do a great job of keeping the group ticking over. So until next time, take care.